Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is one of the most remarkable and certainly consequential financial crimes of the modern era, the Bank of New York Benex scandal. Between roughly 1996 and 1999, something like $7 billion in Russian capital flight and, criminal funds were secretly laundered right through BONY's systems, and it was all facilitated by a single, almost absurdly small office out in Queens. Now, the central question we really need to tackle today isn't just the mechanics of the crime, but its true historical weight. Does the significance of the Benex scandal lie primarily in its role as the catalyst for modern global anti-money laundering legislation, Title III of the USA Patriot Act, or does its ultimate importance rest in what it exposed about the catastrophic socioeconomic vulnerabilities and, frankly, state capture within post-Soviet Russia? So I'll be arguing that the permanent transformation of global financial compliance, the legislative legacy, is actually the greater consequence here.
Okay. Yeah, I come at it from a slightly different way. That's a compelling argument, no doubt. But focusing purely on let's say, the regulatory aftermath risks missing the core trauma, I think. I believe the enduring truth of Benex lies in what it revealed about the absolute plundering of a state. This scandal provided undeniable empirical evidence of a level of corruption and asset stripping that just decimated the Russian economy and contributed directly to its staggering human toll. We're talking mass unemployment, a sharp decline in life expectancy. That exposure of betrayal and the internal rot of a major world power is, for me, that's the primary significance.
Right. But the impact of Benex, I would argue, is global and structural. It proved that the existing system, the one based on assumed trust and correspondent banking, was fatally flawed. Now, for listeners maybe not steeped in financial mechanics, correspondent banking essentially means BONY allowed a Russian bank, DKB Depozitarno Clearingowy Bank, to use its accounts to conduct business in the U.S. It's almost like it was a U.S. bank relying on trust rather than, mandated verification. Benex was so successful precisely because BONY basically acted as DKB's unregulated U.S. front. The failure was so specific, this shell operation run by Peter Berlin moving billions, that it really demanded an equally precise legislative solution. The immediate failure, BONY missing thousands of anomalous transactions, was the direct catalyst for Title III of the USA Patriot Act.
And that legislation, it mandated enhanced due diligence for these foreign correspondent accounts and created the entire modern Know Your Customer, or KYC framework we have today, permanently changing a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Well, that's the scale of systemic change that defines the greater legacy in my view.
I see why you emphasize that systemic fix, I do, but I would frame the significance differently. Focusing purely on the legislative response, it risks treating the symptom, the ease of movement of dirty money, rather than the disease, which was the collapse of the state that generated those funds in the first place. The true significance, I think, lies in what the scheme exposed about the collapse of Russia's governance. It was a process critics accurately termed privatization, not simple privatization. This wasn't just economic policy. It was theft. Privatization means state assets were transferred to private hands, not through any kind of legitimate market process, but through co-option and outright theft by the ruling elite. Benex offered empirical proof that the interests of powerful oligarchs, people like Mamut and Berezovsky, the state apparatus itself, specifically Yeltsin's inner circle, and Russian organized crime like Mogilievich's connection to UBM Magnax had completely fused. Benex wasn't just a conduit, it was the documented exit ramp used by this fused elite to divert the country's assets. And crucially, this included the alleged co-option of that massive $4.8 billion IMF loan tranche in 1998, which, it fled offshore almost immediately after Russia's debt default. The exposure of that wholesale betrayal of the Russian state is the core event for me.
Okay, but when we analyze the institutional failure that the legislation had to fix, the technical precision of the loophole is, it's paramount. The core operational failure at BONY was giving its proprietary electronic banking software, this thing called Micro Cash Register, to Berlin's single shell company. This software was the absolute key. It enabled Berlin to, and I quote, execute hundreds of wire transfers per day without paperwork, right from his little office. This was a mechanical and operational failure in managing correspondent banking facilities, and it is exactly what Title III targeted. The law focused specifically on closing that technical loophole that allowed an unlicensed, essentially unregulated bank to operate right in plain sight, within the heart of the U.S. financial system. Doesn't the ability to mandate global procedural change like that outweigh the revelation of internal corruption, which sadly is a somewhat persistent feature of many post-Soviet transitions?
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the technical error is the primary takeaway. Focusing solely on the software, the tool, it completely misses the systemic greed that really enabled the whole environment. The material we have, it explicitly states that the Benex and related BEX accounts were the highest fee-producing accounts in the One Wall Street branch. Now, this goes way beyond a simple mechanical error. Body management was effectively willfully blind, motivated directly by these aggressive profit targets. The bank was rushing towards really aggressive expansion into the former Soviet bloc, led by high-profile management figures like Natasha Kagalovsky and Vladimir Golitsyn. The exposure revealed that the corporate culture valued that aggressive growth far above basic due diligence. It demonstrated a level of management complicity, whether they were actually indicted or not, that is just far more profound than fixing one piece of faulty code. The greater lesson, I think, for global finance is that the profit incentive itself led a major U.S. institution to just disregard basic ethical and, frankly, legal safeguards.
I appreciate that focus on corporate intent, I do, but isn't intent somewhat secondary to the technical opportunity? My point is that the system, that proprietary software, is what made moving $7 billion possible, regardless of how greedy management might have been. If that specific mechanism hadn't existed, the sheer scale just wouldn't have been achieved. And this is precisely where the legislative impact becomes so significant. The law needed to target the mechanism of abuse, not just the subjective greed, which is harder to police. Title III specifically mandates robust due diligence for correspondent accounts precisely because Boney made the systemic error of equipping DKB's Front, the shell company, with its own operating system. This is why the overhaul was built on the empirical evidence provided by the Benex mechanism itself, creating a standard that now prevents similar scale failures worldwide.
Okay, let's pivot then to the reckoning, or perhaps the lack thereof. If the legislative consequence was truly the most significant outcome, why was the legal and financial accountability so, negligible compared to the damage? For laundering $7 billion, the key conspirators, Peter Berlin and Lucy Edwards, they received minimal sentences. We're talking 6 months house arrest, 5 years probation. Boney's eventual fine was only $38 million. It was a figure universally described at the time as a nuisance figure. I mean, that figure is absolutely dwarfed even by the admittedly aggressive $22.5 billion civil RICO lawsuit filed against the bank by the Russian Federal Customs Service in Moscow. The immediate devastating socioeconomic consequences for the Russian people, that catastrophic decline in life expectancy, the collapse of state services, that vastly outweighs the light financial and legal reckoning imposed on the culprits in the West. That human cost, tied directly to the plunder, that is the primary significance, precisely because the Western legal system, in this instance, failed to deliver meaningful justice.
Right. I see why you stress the perceived inadequacy of the judicial penalty. But low fines and light sentences, they don't negate the global impact of the regulatory reform. The inherent difficulty, let's face it, in prosecuting complex cross-border financial crimes involving sovereign corruption meant that holding individuals fully to account for the totality of the damage was always going to be extremely challenging. If anything, this institutional inability of Western law to really punish sovereign corruption effectively only reinforces my point. Systemic reform was the only meaningful global consequence that was truly achievable. That $38 million fine, paired with Bunny's public admission of systemic failures under the Bank Secrecy Act, it publicly shamed the bank and, importantly, forced the wider financial community to accept its responsibility in facilitating criminal capital flight.
The resulting Title III overhaul created a forward-looking deterrence mechanism, permanently institutionalizing risk management across the entire industry. That's something far more enduring, I'd argue, than punishing two mid-level managers.
But let's just elaborate for a second on that human cost. We are talking about $7 billion flowing out, funds often meant for, state reserves or development projects. This isn't just abstract money moving around. The material we have links this capital flight directly to the state's inability to maintain basic services, fueling hyperinflation, mass poverty. We saw a precipitous drop in male life expectancy in Russia during that period. That's a tangible sign of state collapse and social crisis. The fact that the Benex pipeline was specifically used to siphon off potential recovery funds, like the IMF loan tranche we mentioned, makes it an act of profound betrayal against the entire population. The significance of Benex, therefore, is the definitive evidence it provided that the new Russian elite prioritized self-enrichment and capital export over the very survival, arguably, of their own population. That fundamental exposure of betrayal is the core takeaway, regardless of how robust the subsequent U.S. legislation turned out to be.
That's a very compelling argument about the human cost, certainly. But let me ask you this. Have you considered the timing and the political reality of the legislation itself? While the Benex scandal was massive, yes, and it did indeed push money laundering to the top of the U.S. legislative agenda back in 1999, the ultimate passage of the so-called Benex bill, Title III, required the final urgent political impetus of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Now, if the law required that external geopolitical shock to actually be enacted, doesn't that suggest that the specific revelation about Russian kleptocracy, while critically important, was perhaps less impactful globally than the subsequent powerful association of money laundering with terrorism? That political trigger might suggest the legislative legacy is built more on a foundation of terrorism fear, not solely on the Benex evidence itself.
That is a critical point regarding the political process. I grant you that. I agree the political environment post 9/11 absolutely allowed the bill to pass, facilitated its passage. But I'm not convinced that diminishes the centrality of the Benex evidence. The material reveals, actually, that the intelligence community had already begun fusing the concepts of large-scale capital flight, like we saw with Benex, and national security risks before 9/11. This was largely due to the sheer size of the Benex operation and its clear links to figures like Mogilevich, who was a major figure in transnational organized crime already crossing geopolitical lines.
The very fact that the bill's framework was essentially ready and waiting, and specifically tailored to the failures exposed by Benex, suggests the scandal provided the necessary intellectual and evidentiary blueprint for global reform, even if the final timing, the push over the finish line, was dictated by subsequent tragic events.
I'm not fully convinced by that line of reasoning because I think it risks confusing the political timeline with the intellectual and evidentiary basis of the law itself. As you actually just noted, the legislative language of Title III is a direct, very tailored response to the specific operational failures seen at Benex, not primarily to the mechanics of terrorism financing. It mandates due diligence for correspondent accounts for offshore jurisdictions, the exact mechanisms the Benex-DKB relationship exploited so effectively. The law was constructed specifically to close the Benex loophole, regardless of the subsequent political trigger that finally got it passed. The permanent paradigm shift within global banking from a system of, let's say, assumed trust to one of mandated, rigorous verification, that is the undeniable global consequence flowing directly from the details of the Boney failure. And it affects transactions in every currency, every single minute of the day, worldwide. Well, conversely, I'd argue the ultimate impact has to be judged by the consequences for the society that was so thoroughly plundered. The Benex mechanism, yes, in its precision, provided the final, undeniable proof that the post-Soviet transition was fundamentally corrupted right at the highest levels. And that is a profound historical truth about the nature of power and wealth transition in a former superpower. It's a truth that, for me, overshadows the subsequent, necessary adjustments to U.S. banking software and compliance procedures. So, to conclude my position, while the scale of the socioeconomic tragedy in Russia was undeniably severe, the legislative response initiated by the precise operational failures exposed at the Bank of New York, specifically Title III of the Patriot Act, created the modern global financial compliance regime. It permanently affected the due diligence, the risk assessment, the operational structure of every major bank worldwide. That permanent, mandatory global policy consequence is, I maintain, the scandal's true enduring legacy.
And I'll just reaffirm my view. I come at it differently. The Benex scandal's most profound and frankly damaging truth was its explicit demonstration of post-Soviet privatization. It was the empirical proof that the line separating the interests of the oligarchs, the state apparatus, and Russian organized crime had effectively vanished. They used the Benex-Bani pipeline as their shared, reliable mechanism for systematically plundering national assets. The exposure of that fundamental state capture and the devastating human cost that followed is the lasting lesson we absolutely must heed.
Right. Well, regardless of our specific emphasis, I think we must agree that the Benex scandal provides a really crucial intersection of state failure, corporate complicity, and ultimately global policy response. It clearly demonstrates that this material has to be examined through both a geopolitical lens, focusing on those consequences you highlighted, and a legislative lens, focusing on the institutional reforms that followed to really fully appreciate its true complexity.